looking at the Western Cape and, of course, the fact that it's quite a dominant feature when it comes to the trade market from South Africa, and looking at some of the prospects going forward, of course, United Arab Emirates being one of the key factors. What kind of synergies do you hope to see going forward?
Well, Eleni, I think it's not really about synergies, it's about looking for those new opportunities. I think when we talk about trade and investment in South Africa, sometimes we get the concepts conflated. So we really need to separate it out into trade and into investment. And this trip, which we'll be taking to the Gulf with 15 businesses from the Western Cape and supported by our Premier and 3 of the Cabinet Ministers, is really focusing on those trade opportunities that the United Arab Emirates holds for us. It's an extremely important regional centre. In certain instances, it's actually easier for Western Cape business to get their products into India via the UAE, which illustrates its sort of central logistics role. And then, of course, they're the huge sovereign funds that are domiciled in the UAE. So we will then actually break our trip out into 2 parts. But with this, we'll actually be going into Saudi Arabia as well, where we think there's some really strong export opportunities and investment opportunities. The Saudis have plans to build 4 new cities in Saudi Arabia and link them with highways. And they will spend about $4 trillion on designing and building these cities. And one just has to think that if we could create some space for engineers, consulting engineers, logistics companies, supply companies, what the huge impact would be on our current account.
As you said, you've got to separate the likes of investment and trade. Let's focus on trade for a little bit and looking at the exports that come out from the Western Cape to the UAE, and that's sitting at around 2.3% of total exports coming through from the region. But then again, when you look at the UK, 10.5%, so clearly quite a big gap. Do you plan to see a significant increase going forward?
Well, I think that's the strategy, just in terms of the bilateral trade between the Western Cape and the United Arab Emirates. We're talking about 1.2 billion rands worth of goods. It's obviously distorted when you look at the United Kingdom because that's our largest trading partner and has been for a long time. But there is, however, a challenge for us. If you have the Eurozone forecast for 0% economic growth for this year and next year, that puts a lot of pressure on our exporters. There's shifting consumer preferences. So while we have to defend those markets, we have to look at exploring those new high growth centers. And obviously the Gulf is one of those regions. And I suspect another region that's very important for us is Africa.
Before we get into Africa, let's look at bilateral trade, as you say, to the UAE and, of course, that region. Looking at Saudi Arabia, we get significant imports from them, sitting at 11.7%, Iran at around 11.5%, and China at 10.4%. So clearly, from the import perspective, we're doing quite well.
Well, look, I think the balance of trade is obviously distorted when you look at the Gulf. And the main reason is because we're importing so much crude oil. However, there is a minor success story here because when we bunker the crude oil in Cape Town and it goes to the refinery in Milnerton, once the crude oil has been processed, it obviously breaks out into petroleum and then the byproducts. Now, those byproducts are synthetics, they're lubricants, and they're other chemical products that are used in machinery. And we actually, in turn, export that back into the Gulf. Now, if one looks at their GDP growth forecasts, and if you have a look at the development projects that they have on the table, that's just one product group where there has to be a significant opportunity. And then also, once again, trading on into the region and also across to the Indian, Pakistani subcontinent.
When you look at the UAE and you're talking about the export-import market and looking at the export market, I mean, we're really focusing on the likes of edible fruit and, of course, vegetables as well. And given the fact that you're looking at a very different scenario that's playing out from a weather perspective, comparison to the northern and southern hemispheres, clearly that's something you could also leverage quite extensively.
Yes, I think so. I think if you look at the Western Cape, we're an extremely important export hub for South Africa. 99% of all fish products come out of the Western Cape. If you look at edible fruits and nuts, it's about 85%. And when you get into the fruit juices, wines, etc., that's also sort of low 80s. So the Western Cape's share of South African exports is high. On the agricultural side, there's a great opportunity here for us to actually look at production in the Gulf. And the reason why you want to do that is because it's counter-cyclical. So when we're in season and when Europe's, when we're out of season and so is Europe, you could actually extend your production to that area and produce to get the shoulder side of what would be our main export period in the calendar year.
Nils, let's focus on the African market for a little bit as well. It seems that SADC, of course, also being a key focus for the Western Cape. Do you see a bit more balancing happening towards perhaps a focus towards other African countries as well?
Well, there has to be a focus, and I think for us the focus has to be on the Central African states and then those states along the west coast of Africa. If you bear in mind that the US is currently getting 11% of its crude oil from Africa and intends to get that number up to 25% as soon as possible, you're seeing a bit of an oil rush developing. These states are becoming more wealthy, the middle classes are growing, and the consumer preferences are shifting. If we go and look at the 2008-2009 period, our exports to Cameroon from the Western Cape increased by 68%. And I think this is remarkable because that was right in the middle of the global financial crisis. And one of the products that led that export charge into Cameroon were fish products. Now, with that complicated supply and logistics chain management that one has to look after, you think of refrigeration, on ship, off board, etc. That surely tells us that we can get more products into that market, which is the sixth biggest producer of crude oil in Africa, where you don't require so much attention to the supply chain. I think Ghana and Senegal are emerging success stories, and obviously we have to keep the focus on Nigeria and Angola. There are some outliers as well in this equation. If you look at Sierra Leone, it's forecast for about 11% GDP growth. And I think many of the products and goods and services that they need, we have in the Western Cape. And to back up this new growth on the west coast of Africa, we're seeing the emergence of new supply chains. We know of two shipping lines, one a German company and one a Swedish company, that have set up operations here in the Western Cape in the last year. They're doing shorter and quicker runs into the west coast. They've obviously got limited capacity of what they can take in terms of the ship size. But that will develop and become more sophisticated as we start to catch up with these opportunities in that Central African area and the west coast.